Welcome to Masters of Product Management, powered by Sequent Learning Networks, a show that provides extraordinary insights for product managers who want to go faster and farther in their product management careers.
Hello, this is JJ Rory, Vice President at Sequent Learning Networks. In our Masters of Product Management podcast, we tap into experiences of people who work in and around product management to help you learn and grow in your product management career. We have a very exciting episode today. Gamification is such a cool topic, but one that many people aren't terribly familiar with, myself included, frankly. So I'm very excited about our guest and about our conversation. Gamification generally is the application of typical elements of game playing, point scoring, competition with others, etc., to other areas such as business, marketing, healthcare, or education for the purposes of changing behavior for positive outcomes. My guest today is here to discuss best practices in gamification and behavioral theory and how product managers can leverage some of these principles in this area. Heather Browning is VP of Product at Rhea Health, which has an innovative program that enables people to reduce their drinking. Heather is a growth product leader with a background in game design, cognitive psychology, and behavioral economics. She uses these expertise to build products aimed at sustained behavior change with a focus on improving engagement and retention. Heather, thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, thank you. I'm really excited to be here.
So can you give us some foundational understanding of gamification? What is it? Why and how is it used?
Yeah, so gamification is something that we heard a lot about around 10 years ago. And there was this big movement. It swept through all aspects of our lives. And then it died out a little bit. And we've heard less about it since then. And one of the big reasons for that is the gamification movement took all of these trappings of games. So points, badges, competition, and put those onto other types of systems. So instead of really deeply understanding what a game is and why it's motivating, we just made things that looked more like games. And in some cases, these worked really well. And a lot of those cases were for people who already felt really confident or were already in a good habit of doing the target behavior. So you were more aimed at getting people to improve their already good performance rather than taking someone, for example, who's on the couch and getting them to start riding a bike. You're taking someone who's riding a bike all the time and really helping them do it the best they can. So what I've been doing in my work is how do we get people more from the couch to their first ride?
Very fascinating. Honestly, we're 3 minutes in and I've already learned something. So I had a very kind of general understanding, and your point about how it was quite common. And again, I you're right. I heard about it all the time, 10 years ago. And it's interesting to see how it's kind of evolved. So I'm gonna use your words for a moment and make a little bit of a parallel. So and I'm taking some liberty here, but to use your words, I've read some of your writings. Sustained engagement and motivation is key to clinical interventions. That's obviously the focus of much of your efforts there at Rhea Health. So again, without being flippant and comparing the two, the same could be said about product management and customer experience. That is, sustained engagement and motivation by customers are key to a product success. Do you see it that way?
Yes, I think you're 100% right there. Anytime you have a behavior that you want your user to do, then you're going to be trying to think about how to motivate them to that behavior. And generally, when we think about user behavior, that language tends to be used more in fitness, wellness, medical space. But as a product manager, you really want to think about any activity that you want your user to be doing to be a behavior that you're trying to nudge them towards. Things like Facebook, we don't think of as sort of a gamified experience, but they use a lot of the same tools that we would use in making a gamified experience to create a satisfying user experience that gets people to have the engagement and retention that Facebook is so well known for.
So it sounds like, from what you just said, which is fascinating to me, and I think we could do 14 different episodes just on this. But product managers across the board could learn something from this. So that brings me maybe to my next question, which is, what are some of the ways that behavioral theory can increase engagement and motivation?
Yeah, so a lot of the things that we generally talk about and are fairly industry spread is about reducing friction. So making things easier for the user, setting up a good path. But that's only half of the equation because sometimes we have things that are actually legitimately difficult that we want the user to do. So we can only reduce the friction so much. So the other side of the reducing friction coin is improving motivation. So a lot of my work focuses on how do you improve motivation to do tasks that are maybe slightly more difficult for users. And this is where a lot of the behavioral theory and psychological literature comes in on that. Earlier, I mentioned that the previous gamification movement really helped people who already felt really confident in a skill get better at it. And that's because they have what is termed self efficacy around that behavior. And if you have self efficacy around a behavior, your belief in your ability to do it is strong. We can build self efficacy in our users and create a space for them to be more likely to feel like they can do something if they're starting out from a place of not feeling very confident in their ability. So, one of the main psychological frameworks is about self efficacy and the need for self efficacy in order to get people to do a task. But then obviously the question comes up, well, how do I do that? How do I build self efficacy? Um, and it, because a lot of the time we don't have a growth mindset around that as a culture and a society, but there are proven ways to build self efficacy. And that's one thing that I really love about games and what really drew me to understanding how games work, because these are systems that are optimized to bring high levels of self efficacy to people. So, games are amazing feedback systems. You get feedback on all sorts of things. And there's a psychological theory called self determination theory that talks to how people feel motivated to do something. And the main elements of that are competence, relatedness, and autonomy. So you want to give your user feedback in all of those areas. So competence is perhaps the most obvious one. It is how well you're doing. So, especially how well you're doing compared to yourself rather than compared to other people. So, are you improving? Are you meeting the goals? That kind of thing. So, if you can give your user feedback on how well they're doing, that will give them that aspect of this motivation. So if we think about Facebook again as an example, likes on Facebook can be a form of competency feedback because you are telling the user how well they're doing at making a Facebook post. They can see how well one Facebook posted versus another and feel like they are getting better at the system of Facebook. So the next is relatedness. And that's really about feeling connected to other people. So these are a little harder to quantitatively metricize because it's more about, do I as a user feel connected to people? And so social media in general is a way that we feel connected to people. So when I know what's going on in my friend's life who lives in the UK and I still can feel that connection to them, I'm getting that sense of relatedness and feeling that satisfaction around that connection. And the last is autonomy. So autonomy is basically how much agency do I feel like I have over the system and how much are my decisions really going to matter? Some experiences can feel really on rails to people. And this was another thing that was very common in the early gamification movement is that there weren't a lot of interesting different choices that people could make. There was sort of a path for them to go on and they got points if they did well on this path, but they weren't making meaningful decisions. So you have to think about what is going to feel like a meaningful decision to your user. Uh, Choose Your Own Adventure books can be an example of this. Some people love those and they feel like their choices matter. And some people really don't like them because it really doesn't feel like their choices matter at all. So you have to really know your user and what is going to feel like a meaningful choice to them. And this is, again, user testing and that kind of thing is always how you make the best products. So try these things out, but with the goal of how do I give my user a sense of this meaningful choice.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. Thank you for that. I was just thinking about when you were talking about autonomy specifically, um, the correlation or the applicability that could be with these products that we're now seeing everywhere that have some sort of AI or machine learning, artificial intelligence. Embedded in them. And so I did a podcast not too long ago with a gentleman by the name of Chris Butler, and he's a brilliant guy, all about AI and machine learning. And one of the things that we discussed in that podcast was how does a product manager or product leader instill a sense of control for the customer when there's an embedded artificial intelligence. In other words, the machine or the product is making some decisions for the customer, but we still want the customer to feel in control. And so it's interesting. I think there's an intersection there that could be explored about how we as product leaders and product managers ensure that we use technologies to the betterment of our products and operations and ultimately our customers. But we also realize that there's a very important human aspect and behavioral aspect that we need to include as well.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, there are a lot of decisions that are boring and we don't want to make, right? So having an AI that can make all the boring decisions for you and leaving you free to make all of the creative, interesting decisions would be really ideal, right?
Yeah, and I think that's what product managers who either are AI specific products or having AI embedded in their products are dealing with, right? They're trying to balance that machine and human aspect. So it's very interesting. So anyway, that's fascinating. So let's turn to maybe some best practices in gamification that you've identified.
Yeah. And so, one best practice is always test, test, test. You always want to make sure that the system you're setting up is creating the user behavior that you want and creating the emotions and the experience that you're really setting up for your users. And again, back to the how do we get people who are starting off with a low level of self efficacy around the behavior that you want them to target? So, people who maybe aren't really well identified with being a book reader, how would you make them read more books? People who aren't really identified as being good at riding a bike, how are you going to get them to ride more bikes? Those kinds of things. We want to go back to the game system and how game systems work. And one of the reasons that game systems are so good at giving you this sense of confidence in yourself is because they show you that the results don't matter. How well you do on a game doesn't necessarily reflect on your ego unless gaming is a really important part of your identification. But in general, if we're thinking more of people playing a game for fun, what you're going to have is this, oh, if I fail at this, this is going to be an interesting piece of data that's going to tell me how I can do better next time. And so this is what we want as far as encouraging growth mindset in general is someone tries something, they fail, they're like, oh, that's interesting. I could try it again differently this time. And so creating that dynamic of things are possible and things don't reflect badly on my ego if they go bad. And the real key to that, and this was the thing, again, that was really missed in the initial gamification movement, is you have to separate out your target user behavior from their in game goal. So if you want someone to meet more of their sale targets and you're giving them points per sale, that is their in-experience goal is aligned with what your outcome for them is or what your real world behavior that you want them to do is. But what you want to do is separate those two out. So if you had an app and you wanted to encourage people to read more, you wouldn't necessarily, the best thing to do, at least for, again, people who are already not identified as, I read a lot and this is great, but for people who are like, I really should read more, but I don't. For those people, what you'd want to do is not give them points per book they read or points per word. You want to give them a separate goal that the only way they could achieve that goal is through reading a book. So a goal might be finding the most unique word per book. So that's something that really has nothing to do with reading and has a little bit of a problem solving is if they're going to try and guess which word in this whole book is the most unique to this book. But the only way they can accomplish that goal is through reading it. And for a personal story, I changed my diet very dramatically over the last year. And the way I set that up for myself is I decided that I would learn how to cook Ethiopian food because Ethiopian food fit into the diet that I was moving towards. And so instead of thinking about, oh, how am I going to cut all these things out of my diet, I just learned to cook Ethiopian food. So then all of the food that was around for me to eat was Ethiopian food. And it became really easy to switch what I was eating to that because I'd set up this separate goal, which was a fun goal, learning how to cook something because I really love cooking. And through doing that, I accomplished the behavior I wanted me to do, which is to be eating only these certain things.
Wow, that's very cool. I love that story, and it's so interesting. Like you said, it's my when I think of gamification or using games for behavior, it's that very initial layer, right? And so you're showing us a layer deeper of it's not about a point per the goal, right? You have to understand the difference. I love the book example, the Ethiopian food. That's very interesting. Wow. I could talk to you for hours. Any final words of wisdom for those of us out there who may be including gamification in products and services?
Yeah. The first one is do a lot of user testing. Always make sure that your assumptions are correct and that the system you set up is creating the dynamics that you want to see. And again, remember that you want to add elements of competence, relatedness, and autonomy to your system. in order to really have that motivating feeling from your users, and to really set up the inexperience the inside the experience goal of the user to be separate from what the behavior you want to see the user perform is. And so just remember, all of those things together are going to create a really deeply motivational experience.
That's perfect. This has been such a fascinating discussion. Gamification, just such a great tool for so many purposes. Thank you, Heather Browning, for sharing your expertise, helping me learn. I know those who are listening also learned some things from you. So thank you again so much for joining me.
Thank you.
So thank you all for joining us on Masters of Product Management, powered by Sequent Learning Networks. I am JJ Rory, and I look forward to speaking with you on the next episode.
You've been listening to Masters of Product Management, powered by Sequent Learning Networks. If you'd like to take your career to the next level with additional tools, training, coaching, and books, be sure to visit Sequent Learning Networks at sequentlearning.com.